Hello, my name is Dr. Jim Krause, and I'm a professor at the Medical University of South Carolina, and I'm going to be talking today about a study of quality employment outcomes among individuals with MS, and Melinda Jarnicki helped me to put together this presentation. It is a part of our overall research program, Health, Employment, and Longevity. This information is a product of the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center at Virginia Commonwealth University. The RRTC is dedicated to employment for individuals with physical disability. And our program of research is based, we call ourselves the program related to employment. We have a couple of different areas of focus, and our employment focus, we call ourselves Beyond 90 Days, Quality Employment Throughout the Work Life Cycle. And our emphasis of Beyond 90 Days is that things don't end employment-wise after 90 days of being employed, although sometimes services are terminated and individuals are deemed successfully rehabilitated. At that time, that's only the beginning. It's a great start. We look at quality employment outcomes throughout the life cycle. We have two study populations currently, individuals with multiple sclerosis. That is being funded by this current grant, spinal cord injury, and we are looking at other populations in our planning, including TBI and epilepsy. I'm just going to cover the elements of the presentation, which will be, I will talk about the purpose, the background, give you an overview of the two stages of the study. I'll describe the qualitative findings, and then I'll talk about some of the preliminary current findings from the quantitative portion of the study, and then discuss future directions, and specifically some comparisons with the data collected from the MS Society, and secondarily the comparison between MS and SCI. So the global purpose of the presentation, or of our program, is to identify characteristics associated with successful employment throughout the work life cycle among people with physical disability. That's our broad goal. And specifically with this project, to identify characteristics associated with successful employment after MS using both qualitative and quantitative methodologies, and to identify what's of primary importance to people with MS. That is our specific purpose. In the future, we will have more detailed analysis of predictors of employment. MS affects approximately 2.3 million people worldwide. Most people are diagnosed between the ages of 20 and 50, so this is a prime time for career development, and so it is a time frame of concern. Despite the benefits of employment to quality of life and well-being, people with MS report some of the highest rates of unemployment among groups of individuals with severe and chronic disabilities. And the current literature, really, there's just not much out there examining subjective aspects of employment among individuals with MS. So our study, again, used a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods. The qualitative stage includes open-ended focus groups to identify themes and patterns of employment experience. Our quantitative stage, we are obtaining assessments regarding employment and identifying factors related to the most successful outcomes. Okay, for just a very brief overview of our methods, the qualitative study, we conducted 8 focus groups in 3 different states: Ohio, Georgia, South Carolina. Up in Ohio with our colleague and consultant, Dr. Philip Rumriel. South Carolina is our home base, and then in Atlanta, that is the Shepherd Center. 74 individuals participated. A qualitative analysis of focus group narratives was conducted. The second stage was quantitative. It's in progress. Currently we have 303 respondents. Our target rate is 1,050, and we will use econometric modeling in the future to analyze the data. So study one, our qualitative data. Global purpose is to identify predictors and outcomes from the perspective of the person with MS and interpret those narratives to generate conceptual categories based on inductive or deductive approaches. So basically, the difference between the importance of the qualitative research is we're getting the perspective of the individual with MS. Specifically, for the presentation I'm doing, we're focusing on disclosure in the employment setting. It's Corey Hayward with the water. We had conducted the 8 focus groups. There were 4 to 9 participants in each. The average age was 47. Average age at diagnosis was just under 35. So just under 12 years average time since diagnosis. So again, a relatively long period of time on average. About 80% were women, and that's typical of MS. And the percent employed was 58%, higher than what would be reported in the literature, but again, we were selecting individuals that could speak to their employment experiences. So that's not a representative percentage, but it does help us to gain the perspectives of people that have MS who have been employed. We used a semi-structured format lasting 2 to 3 hours, and all the groups were recorded, transcripts were generated, and we were able to use some nice software and Vivo for text analysis. So the results of this, basically, we identified 8 themes and under 2 general categories. And the first category was the decision to disclose. And that's a very important decision for people. It's very personal often. If you don't disclose, you don't have any opportunity to receive any accommodations. So if you need a job accommodation, you need to disclose. And so the decision to disclose is very important. People identified 4 themes within the larger theme. Disclosing to explain, prepare, or educate. So a very positive approach in that sense of trying to help people to understand the MS, to prepare them for what might be needed, and just to educate them. Another theme was some individuals, there really were no concerns regarding disclosure. They disclosed as they chose to do so, but they did not see it as problematic. Another theme was limiting, delaying, or deciding not to disclose. So there was a theme of apprehension about disclosure, and again, a portion of people had this concern. And then there was also uncertainty about future disclosure. And then the other fell within the theme of consequences of disclosure, and I will come back to that in a little bit. So you can see the graphic. There are examples of each of the 4 themes. So again, these are just comments people made that reflect these themes. So again, I didn't have any problems because it's different. With the medical field, someone working in the medical field saw no problem. Others found supportive reactions, and others not so much. So this is the theory of reasoned action and the theory of planned behavior. It's basically, where do we go from here? So we have from the qualitative interviews, which again I need to reiterate and emphasize that the qualitative interviews, the focus on disclosure, was only a small part of that group process. It actually emerged from the group process. It was not something we even included within the project design. So it's an emerging theme that we are following up on. So we have the general classifications of disclosure. but now it's how can we investigate this more thoroughly. And so I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about the theory of behavior, reasoned action and planned behavior. It's a theory by Eisen and Fishbein, but basically any behavior, if you'll notice on the far right, there is a behavior, and what precedes that is some intention to perform a behavior. So in terms of disclosing, we can ask people who have not disclosed, do you intend to disclose or not? And they're probably going to give us a good answer. But it's some of the reasons why they may choose or have that intention. And these are important to understand because they help us understand the process by which people would go through in making decisions regarding disclosure, and therefore they could be used in a service delivery setting to explore what are the reasons that someone might choose to disclose or not disclose. So the three primary parameters are attitude. So what's our attitude toward disclosing? How do they feel about that behavior? What do they think the outcomes might be? The second is what's called a subjective norm. And a subjective norm is really what do people around you think? So it's someone's normative beliefs. I believe my family thinks I should disclose, or my significant other feels I should disclose, or my friends feel I should disclose. And depending on whether those friends have a disability or their point of perspective might make a difference. And as will someone's motivation to comply with those requests. So the closer to the individual, there may be more of an emphasis on complying. And then the last factor is perceived control. So someone has their attitude toward disclosure, they know what other people feel they should do, they're weighing that. And then the third factor, control beliefs. So is this something I feel confident that I can do? And do I really have any power over that decision? So again, as applied to disclosure, it may be that if an individual is having symptoms in a work setting, then they may feel that they really don't have control over that behavior of disclosing. They may feel they really have no alternative because it's becoming apparent, or maybe maybe what are symptoms of MS might be misinterpreted as something different. Next. So again, the themes identified many subjective areas of employment, and we synthesized them into an outcome measure to better quantify the themes derived from this stage of the study. So I'll move on to the quantitative portion of the study. And the quantitative portion is basically where we take what we've looked at qualitatively, incorporate it into instruments, and then rather than ask it of a few people, we ask it of a lot of people. And it allows us to more systematically evaluate the results. So our global purpose is to incorporate the qualitative findings and use a labor force participation model and as a basis for structuring and selecting predictors with diverse employment outcomes. So, that's very wordy. What does it mean? We want to find out what influences favorable outcomes. If we can understand what leads to better outcomes, then we hope we can produce better outcomes. And secondly, and more specifically with regards to what I'm presenting today, we directly are focusing on one very specific aspect of our study, and it is using the preliminary data. But what do people value in their jobs, and how satisfied are they? So what you see here is our labor force participation model, or labor participation model. And the key components that you'll see, there are several boxes, but there are three primary boxes. One reflecting outcomes, and the other two reflecting factors related to the outcomes. So the first thing we've done is we separated those things of what we call attributable differences or control characteristics. And so control characteristics within the statistical design simply means that they're variables we want to control for, look at how they relate to the outcomes. and they provide some general information, but those things are not changeable. So there are things like age at diagnosis, date of diagnosis, ethnicity, race, gender, demographics basically, or disability characteristics. Those really are not changeable. We could argue that function can be changed, but within the context of employment in this type of study where we observe across a large number of people, those are things that in terms of how the information is used, it would only be used to help our understanding of how the outcomes vary and potentially which groups to focus on. Now, what we're calling policy variables are other characteristics that may be more changeable. And these are derived actually from a different model that we developed in the 1998, in fact, to predict secondary health conditions after traumatic injury. And so we've broken these down into a number of areas, but the areas primarily psychological characteristics, behavioral characteristics, and environmental characteristics. And all these things are on a substrate of health. Health, of course, makes a difference too. But the sort of psychological characteristics, what are people interested in? What are their vocational interests? What do they want to do? After a disability, people can't do the same things. So if someone's interested in occupations where they use their hands or physical strength, and that's compromised by the disability, then that's important to know how that matches, and that's why we are measuring vocational interest within a subsample. We also have behaviors, so there are many behaviors relevant to employment, things like have people filled out a resume, have they done anything to move closer to a job, have they looked in the paper to see what jobs might be available to them, have they gone on a job interview. And then environmental supports, which are quite broad-ranging. They're things like what sorts of VR services someone has, what neighborhood do they grow up in, what's their geographic location, have they received job accommodations, what are their work incentives, what are their barriers. And then in terms of outcomes, we define it in two groups. We're not going to be looking at these today, but I'll allude to them because they will come up in the future as we get further in our data collection. But things that reflect the participation in employment. So is somebody working? How many hours are they working? How many job lapses have they had where they've needed to stop working and go back to work? What's the number of jobs, years employed, things like that. And then we have the quality outcomes, which are things like earnings, job type. Are people getting rewarded for their work? Are they getting promoted? What's their level of job satisfaction? Next. So our methods are to target 1,050 people. We have just over 300 currently, although the data that I'm presenting on are 153 people. These are all people within the employment age range that are eligible for the study. And we've collected the data through mail and web assessments. Our instrument has expansive coverage of outcome areas. It's linked with national data sets when we can. So what that means is we've asked questions that can be compared where there is national data. We've asked the questions in ways that were asked in the national surveys. And national surveys are very limited in terms of what we can learn related to disability. We can get a general employment rate for people within a very broad category of people that say have an activity limitation. Or some type of hearing impairment, or some type of visual impairment, but getting the details of this is MS versus SCI versus another diagnosis. You cannot get that in the typical national data set, much less the detail of diagnoses. So the preliminary results, 153 people, again, current age 53, 39 years of age at diagnosis. It is a relatively well-educated group, averaging 15 years of education. The vast majority, 3/4, are relapsing, remitting in terms of a diagnosis, but also 9% primary progressive and 8% secondary progressive. Now, we're identifying our cohort from the Shepherd Center in Atlanta, Georgia, our collaborator, and therefore they are really a group that have received clinical services. So we consider it to be an active group. In terms of that, it's different than, say, an MS Society group, which is more of a self-help group. So this, again, you always have to consider what is the source of your participants. 77% were employed within 3 months after diagnosis, or at 3 months after diagnosis, according to their reports. This dropped to 68% by year 1, and about 45% currently within our study time frame. And again, this is a relatively small sample. These numbers may change as we collect more cases. I would expect they would, but you can see the general pattern of people leaving the workforce. So employment considerations. We ask people about this even if they are currently unemployed or retired. There were 10 themes that came out of the qualitative groups, and this is where we identified the themes directly. And these are employment considerations, and so they're basically things that people would like to get from being employed. And you can see that what was people rated as extremely important at the time they took the instrument self-report assessment was health insurance, 55% stating it's extremely important. Other things were enjoyment from working, opportunities for helping others, feeling good about oneself by virtue of working, and salary, but salary was not as high as some of the other considerations. Next. So we performed a factor analysis, which is a data reduction technique. We use principal axis factor analysis, Verimax rotation, and some of the considerations are that we had a relatively low sample size to be doing this. This is just a preliminary analysis. Again, we had only 10 variables, and we grouped people based on eigenvalues or factors based on eigenvalues greater than 1. We developed Scree plots to look at. So if you're not familiar with factor analysis, it simply takes response patterns. So if one person responding to one item makes it more likely that they'll respond to another, it pulls the items together where there are similar patterns across individuals. This is a Scree plot that just shows for people's, again, what they want from their jobs, from their careers, and it basically you follow the bend. The first bend is at 2, and that's consistent with the eigenvalues that we had 2 factors that emerged from this. So 2 general themes from the 10 areas. So the first theme, you can see the items that were heavily loaded with this factor: social connections, enjoyment from working, opportunities for helping others. So this is much of sort of the intrinsic benefits of work, or the intangible benefits, whereas the other theme reflected more tangible aspects: salary, health insurance, opportunities for advancement, recognition of performance. Now I'm going to talk about employment satisfaction at the time of the MS diagnosis. You can see we have the same 10 items, only now, instead of how important it is, you'll see how satisfied people are with these. And what you will see that people are most satisfied, or at the time of the MS diagnosis were most satisfied. Enjoyment from working, feeling better about self, opportunities for helping others, staying busy, all were in that range. Health insurance as well, of people that had with 35% or more that said they were very satisfied. So if you just look at the overall pattern, you look at the very dissatisfied and dissatisfied, for the most part, people tended to be satisfied with their employment, a lot in the neutral category, so far from uniform. The things that they seemed least satisfied with were either sharing the workload, opportunities for advancement, salary, and recognition. So we again did a factor analysis, and this is a Scree plot again, and it, similar to the others, showed two factors. Okay. And again, if you look at the pattern, so we see a parallel between what individuals are, what they've placed value on or importance on, and you see a similar pattern when you look at the factors that are emerge from what they're satisfied with. And again, you could call it intangible and tangible benefits of employment. So then we looked at current employment. And you can see here now, this is the same set of items, but you'll notice immediately that for current employment, when you look at the very satisfied column, that those numbers are very different than what we saw before. Some things are very low, such as others share the workload, recognition is very low, salary, and opportunities for advancement. So one thing I need to point out is that this group is not as large as the group that was working at the time of MS onset. So they're not all the same people. Some people fell out of the study by virtue of quitting working. But even if we would look at those, we would not see, or we would still see the decrease in satisfaction. So you can see that over time, that people have gone from being really pretty satisfied in a lot of areas to, on average, not being very satisfied. This is your last Scree plot to look at, and again you see the same you see that it is two factors. Next. But your loadings are a little bit different. So this is a little bit different. We'll have to see how it turns out when we have a larger cohort, but you see a little more overlap than you did before. Enjoyment from working is now closer, more closely tied with the tangible benefits that come from employment, the salary, health insurance, opportunities for advancement, and recognition of performance. And that's a little different. Others sharing the workload now also is with that factor, whereas previously it was more with the intangibles. And the intangibles still do form a second factor. So we did some final comparisons to just help clarify how satisfaction changed between the time of MS and the time of current employment. And basically we took those first three categories, the ones that were very dissatisfied, and neutral, and grouped those together, and we grouped satisfied and very satisfied together to simplify the graphs. And here is the first graph. Getting a little sloppy with the water here late in the presentation. So satisfaction with salary. You can see the blue line is at the time of diagnosis, and the portion of people that were satisfied was about 15% higher than with current employment. Now you can see the gap with satisfaction with insurance. Again, there's the decline, but you see the gap is greater when you look, it's over 20 percentage points. And satisfaction with advancement is even less, so you only have 35% of the people thereabouts with current employment who are satisfied or very satisfied with the amount of advancement they get. Recognition, again, similar. There's quite a disparity. Social connections, not quite as great a disparity as than was apparent at the time of MS diagnosis, but still a disparity. Enjoyment from working, a little bit of a decline. Same with opportunities for helping others and feeling better about self as a result of working. Staying busy, same in general, modest decline. And sharing the workload, this is where it becomes much greater. So that, what that represents, we can only speculate on, but it seems that, that having people share the workload is obviously very important after MS, and that people did not feel that was not an area they were very satisfied with. So in total of those, again, when we talked about tangible and intangible benefits, the greater the declines over time seem to be with the intangible, with the tangible things like salary recognition and benefits, whereas people tended to report less decline in terms of the areas that were more intangible. So where do we go from here? What are our future directions? We are going to compare our results with that of research conducted with the MS Society. And the MS Society research has been conducted by Dr. Phil Rumrill, who is an outstanding investigator, well established, and Phil did a large-scale study of people within the MS Society. So what we did was, when we designed our questionnaire, we, in addition to following the national surveys, we kept a number of item sets consistent with the way Phil measured them. This is just a very, very small portion of our overall measure, but what we did do is we maintained our ability to look at current employment and occupation, accommodations and accessibility, likeliness of reducing the workload in the future, some of the demographics, benefits, and course of illness. We also asked a lot of questions within our study that will help us compare with national, I know I mentioned it earlier, but national data. So again, we kept some questions identical, but we also kept the diagnostic questions identical. So we asked the same basic questions that are asked within the general population data, so that we can compare not just our MS participants or a different cohort like our spinal cord injury with those national data, but we can actually look at the way they responded to the items that are used for diagnosis with the national data sets. So some of the future analyses that are planned, the strong interest inventory again, we're going to look at that, and occupation, and see how that relates in terms of, the fit between an individual's physical abilities, the nature of the occupation they have, and their vocational interests. We will look at diagnoses and look at the effects of diagnoses on employment. So we won't simply look at and level of impairment. So we won't simply look at MS as a group as a whole, but we will look at people with different diagnoses, different amounts of time since diagnoses. And again, we will look at quality outcomes related to salary satisfaction and other things like promotions and awards. Lastly, we will make comparisons with other populations. We have a parallel study with spinal cord injury where we have about 1,000 cases collected to date. That study will eventually have 2,500 people thereabouts, and will draw direct comparisons between MS and SCI, not just in terms of the outcomes themselves, such as comparing employment rates or satisfaction, but looking at the relationships. So are there the same predictors? Do the same sorts of environmental experiences or psychological characteristics predict the outcomes in the same way? And then we'll be able to build upon this framework with other populations. So expanding it to people with TBI, for instance, people with epilepsy, people with amputation or cerebral palsy. These are all possibilities. And in closing, I'd like to again acknowledge the VCU Research and Training Center. Also, I'd like to very specifically acknowledge the Shepherd Center in Atlanta, Georgia. It's one of our collaborators. And I'd like also to acknowledge our consultants, Michelle Mead, Dr. Phil Rumrill. Michelle Mead worked with the qualitative study, did an outstanding job. And Dr. David Gray, who passed away last year. And Dr. Gray was instrumental in the development of the project. And we'd like to thank the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research for the funding. This is a picture of our team. A lot of good people work really hard so that we can generate the research information to help people, hopefully help with policy decisions, help practitioners when they're doing their practice, and help people with disabilities to enhance their employment outcomes. And this is the contact information. Thank you very much.